Pure, molten fury surged through me, so hot it almost scalded my lungs. My hand, the one clutching the flimsy piece of paper, wasn't just trembling from shock, it was vibrating with a rage I hadn't felt since, well, maybe ever. Across the narrow, suddenly suffocating hallway of my own apartment stood my landlord, Mr. Henderson. Arms crossed, a smug, tight little smirk playing on his lips. It was the smirk of a cat who'd cornered a mouse and was savoring the moment before the kill. 30 days, he stated, his voice a horribly calm counterpoint to the storm inside me. Smooth, cold, like polished river stones skipping over water. For repeated noise violations. It's official, Sarah. You need to vacate the premises. The words hung there, obscene in their injustice. My heart felt like it was trying to batter its way out of my chest. Noise violations? What noise? The frantic typing on my keyboard trying to meet a deadline? The quiet hum of the ancient refrigerator? The sound of me simply existing in my own home? I desperately wanted to scream, to unleash the torrent of questions and accusations boiling inside me, to demand he look me in the eye and tell me specifically what crime I'd committed. But my throat closed up. All that escaped was a strangled, pathetic whisper. This is ridiculous. What are you even talking about? I haven't done anything. He just shrugged, a tiny, dismissive movement of his shoulders. The smirk widened, just a fraction, but it felt like a mile. Rules are rules, he intoned, as if quoting scripture. Complaints were made. My hands are tied. He gestured vaguely towards the eviction notice, that white flag of surrender he was forcing on me. Liar. His hands weren't tied. They were actively, deliberately orchestrating my downfall. He thought he had me cornered. He saw me, Sarah, just some young woman starting out, easily intimidated, easily disposed of. Someone who'd just pack her bags and scurry away when faced with official-looking paper. Standing there, feeling the beige walls of the hallway press in, feeling the weight of his smug certainty, something else began to tremble inside me. Not fear, not anymore. It was the cold, hard vibration of resolve. He thought this piece of paper was the final word. He thought he'd won. Oh, the spectacular arrogance of it. He had absolutely no idea what he'd just kicked over. This wasn't just an eviction. It was him handing me the rulebook he thought only he could use. And I was about to beat him at his own game. This war wasn't over. It was just beginning. Before Mr. Henderson decided to detonate my life, things were, well, beautifully, blessedly ordinary. Predictable, even. I'm Sarah, a graphic designer just starting to find my footing in a competitive field. Landing this apartment felt like finally reaching solid ground after months wading through the murky waters of the city's rental market. I'd seen places barely bigger than closets demanding astronomical sums, dealt with potential roommates who had hygiene standards best described as optional, and endured countless open houses feeling like cattle being judged. Then I found this place, tucked away on the third floor of a slightly faded, pre-war brick building on a quiet, leafy street. It wasn't glamorous. The radiators hissed dramatically in winter, the kitchen linoleum had a pattern best forgotten by history, and the bathroom tiles were an unfortunate shade of avocado green. But sunlight streamed through the large living room window in the afternoons. The rent was actually manageable, a miracle I attributed to the building's age and maybe a landlord who wasn't aggressively chasing top dollar, and it had potential. Loads of it. Most importantly, it felt like mine. My own little corner of the universe. I poured my heart and what little disposable income one had into making it home. I spent a whole weekend meticulously painting the bedroom wall a deep, calming teal. I wrestled cheap fairy lights onto the tiny wrought iron balcony until it looked magical at night. My furniture was a curated collection of thrift store finds and hand-me-downs, each piece with its own story. It wasn't just four walls. It was my sanctuary, my launch pad, the stable base I needed while navigating the stressful waters of freelance design work and trying to build a life. That stability felt precious, hard-won. Mr. Henderson, the landlord who lived in the ground floor unit and managed the building himself, seemed unremarkable during the initial viewing and lease signing. Late 50s, maybe early 60s, thinning gray hair combed carefully over a freckled scalp, a wardrobe seemingly consisting entirely of slightly rumpled button-down shirts and slacks that had seen better decades. He was polite, professional, but reserved. He went through the lease clause by clause, his explanations concise, almost clipped. "Standard stuff," he'd said, handing me a pen. "Trash days are Tuesday and Friday. Rent due on the 1st. No loud parties." He pointedly tapped the clause about quiet hours, 10 p.m. to 8 a.m. Common courtesy, you know. Respect thy neighbor. I nodded enthusiastically. Of course. I'm pretty quiet myself. Mostly just work and Netflix. He offered a brief, tight-lipped smile as I handed over the hefty cashier's check for the deposit and first month's rent. Thinking back, that tap wasn't just emphasis, it was him establishing his territory, his rules. A subtle power play I was too thrilled about finally having my own place to recognize. For the first few months, it was perfect. I settled into a comfortable routine. Wake up, make coffee in my slightly too small kitchen, work on my makeshift desk overlooking the street, maybe take a walk under the canopy of trees in the evening. I even exchanged pleasantries with Mrs. Petrov, the sweet, elderly Russian lady in 2B, who always seemed to be tending her window box overflowing with geraniums. Life felt good. Simple. Secure. The kind of quiet security you don't appreciate until it's violently ripped away. The first tremor that hinted at the coming earthquake happened about 4 months in. It was a Tuesday evening, around 7:30. I was making pasta, listening to a true crime podcast on my phone's speaker while garlic sizzled in the pan. It wasn't loud, definitely not loud enough to penetrate floors or thick old walls, just ambient noise. Suddenly, a sharp, insistent rap echoed through my apartment. Knock, knock, knock. Sharper than a friendly neighbor knock. I wiped my hands, turned down the podcast volume instinctively, and opened the door. Mr. Henderson stood there, his face set in lines of distinct disapproval. His usual neutral mask was gone. "Sarah," he began, his voice tight-clipped. "No preamble, no pleasantries. I need you to keep the noise down." I blinked, genuinely thrown. My mind raced. Was the sizzling garlic that loud? "Noise?" I asked, glancing back towards my kitchen. "I'm sorry, what noise?" "I'm just cooking dinner, listening to a podcast." I trailed off, confused. "The music," he said, cutting me off, gesturing vaguely towards the inside of my apartment with a flick of his chin. "It's too loud. I've received a complaint." My jaw nearly dropped. A complaint? At 7:30 in the evening? About a podcast playing at barely conversational volume? It felt utterly surreal. "Oh," I stammered, feeling my cheeks flush. It felt like being unfairly scolded as a child. I'm really sorry, Mr. Henderson. I had no idea it was carrying. I'll turn it right off." I immediately switched to using my earbuds, even though cooking with them in was awkward. He just gave a curt, dismissive nod. "See that you do." And then he turned and walked away, his footsteps heavy on the worn hallway carpet. I closed the door slowly, leaning against it, feeling a strange mixture of embarrassment and indignation. Who on earth could have complained? Mrs. Petrov downstairs? Highly unlikely. She seemed half-deaf and lovely. The young couple across the hall? They often had music playing themselves. It didn't add up. The interaction left a sour taste, a tiny prickle of unease beneath my skin. A couple of weeks later, the second incident. It was a Saturday afternoon, maybe 2 o'clock. Prime get chores done time. I was vacuuming the living room rug, a task that, by its very nature, makes noise. Again, the sharp knock. Again, Mr. Henderson, looking even more put upon. "Sarah," he sighed dramatically, as if dealing with a repeat offender. the vacuuming. It's extremely loud. It's disturbing the other tenants. This time, annoyance flared brighter than confusion. "Mr. Henderson, it's 2 o'clock on a Saturday afternoon," I said, trying to keep my voice level but firm. "People vacuum their apartments. It's a normal sound." "Not that loudly," he retorted, his eyes narrowing slightly. "And not for that long. Please try to be more considerate of others." He didn't wait for a response, just turned and retreated down the stairs. Considerate? I was being considerate. I wasn't vacuuming at midnight. I finished quickly, feeling watched, judged. A knot of anxiety started forming in my stomach. This felt weird. Targeted, almost. Was he just hypersensitive? Or was there something else driving this? The question hung in the air, unanswered, casting the first real shadow over my sunny little apartment. Then came the first rent increase notice, slipped quietly under my door a month later. It cited vague, increased operating costs and bumped my rent up by a percentage that felt steep, especially on my tight budget. It stung, but rent hikes were part of city life, right? I didn't want to rock the boat. I wanted to keep my home. So, I tightened my belt, canceled a subscription service, packed my lunch more diligently, and paid it without protest. But that knot of unease tightened. The timing, right after the noise complaint started, it felt less like coincidence and more like something else. Something I couldn't quite put my finger on yet. That shadow didn't just linger. It began to creep across everything, darkening the corners of my once happy home over the following months. The noise complaints morphed from occasional annoyances into a bizarre, relentless campaign. It felt like living under surveillance. One evening, around 10:45 p.m., my phone buzzed. A text from Mr. Henderson. "Excessive noise detected from apt 3C. Footsteps. Please keep it down. Final warning." I was lying perfectly still in bed, reading a book. The only sound was the rustle of a page turning. My blood ran cold. Was he literally standing outside my door, listening? The thought made my skin crawl. It felt profoundly invasive, deeply creepy. Another time, I had my best friend, Chloe, over for dinner. We were catching up, talking and laughing, not riotously, just the normal sounds of two friends enjoying each other's company on a Friday night. We finished around 10:30. The next morning, I opened my door to find a note taped, not slipped under, but taped firmly at eye level to the wood. Bold, black marker on cheap notebook paper. Respect quiet hours, 10 p.m. Your continued disregard is unacceptable. Further violations will be formally documented. My face burned with a mixture of fury and humiliation. It felt so public, so accusatory. Were my neighbors seeing this? Did they think I was some inconsiderate nightmare tenant throwing wild parties? I started noticing Mr. Henderson more often, too. He seemed to materialize in the hallway whenever I was coming or going, pretending to check the mailboxes or sweep the already clean steps, his eyes darting towards me, cold and appraising. There was no more polite nodding, just a stiff, pointed silence or a barely concealed glare. One afternoon, I was coming up the stairs as he was talking to Mrs. Petrov near her door. I slowed my steps, pretending to fumble with my keys. I couldn't hear everything, but the snippets that drifted down the stairwell were chilling. Third floor, no respect for others, always noise. Young people today, no consideration. He was actively poisoning the well, painting me as a problem tenant behind my back. The constant low-level stress became my unwanted companion. I started moving around my own apartment like a ghost. I'd catch myself holding my breath when I walked across the living room late at night. I'd hesitate before using the blender in the morning, opting for quieter breakfasts. Dropping a spoon felt catastrophic, sending jolts of adrenaline through me as I braced for the inevitable knock or text. My sanctuary, my safe space, was transforming into a source of perpetual anxiety. Sleep became difficult, interrupted by worries about what innocuous sound might trigger the next complaint. My focus at work suffered. Then, exactly 6 months after the first increase, another notice appeared under my door. Another rent hike. This one was even larger than the first, pushing my rent well beyond what felt reasonable for the unit and significantly higher than my original agreement. The justification this time was even flimsier: general building maintenance and improvements. What improvements? The lobby light still flickered intermittently. The washing machine in the basement still sometimes ate quarters without starting, and the paint in the hallway was still peeling. This felt personal. It felt punitive. It felt like he was deliberately trying to price me out. The suspicion that had been a small knot hardened into a cold certainty. This wasn't about noise. It couldn't be. No rational person would complain about page turning or Saturday vacuuming. This was about something else. Money, most likely. Getting rid of me, the tenant who had locked in a slightly below market rate, so he could slap on a coat of cheap paint and charge the next person significantly more. The realization brought a wave of anger, but also fear. Could he actually succeed? I started meticulously organizing everything. I created a dedicated folder on my computer and a physical one. Every text message saved with timestamps. Every passive-aggressive note photographed and filed. I kept a detailed log. Date, time, the alleged noise, what I was actually doing usually, existing quietly, and any interaction with Henderson. A grim determination settled in. This wasn't just landlord pickiness anymore. It felt like a calculated strategy. And I had a sinking feeling I knew exactly where this train was headed. The final act of Mr. Henderson's campaign arrived with brutal efficiency. It wasn't just about the passive-aggressive notes or the phantom noise complaints anymore. It escalated into something that felt like targeted harassment designed to break me. He began exercising his right to enter for inspections with the absolute bare minimum notice allowed by law. Usually just a curt note slipped under my door less than 24 hours beforehand. These weren't quick checks. He'd arrive, clipboard in hand, his face an unreadable mask, and proceed to scrutinize every inch of my apartment. He'd walk slowly through each room, peering intently at the walls, running a finger along windowsills, tapping on tiles in the bathroom, shining a flashlight into the back of closets. He'd make vague, humming noises under his breath. Just checking for preventative maintenance. He'd mutter if I asked what he was looking for, but his eyes lingered on my belongings, on the way I lived, in a way that felt judgmental and invasive. Once, he commented on a tiny scuff mark on the baseboard near my desk, likely from my chair. "Need to be more careful," he'd said, making a deliberate note on his clipboard. It felt less like maintenance and more like he was desperately searching for any excuse, any tiny violation of the lease terms, to add to his imaginary arsenal against me. Having him in my space, rifling through my home under the guise of inspection, left me feeling exposed and furious. I made sure I was always present, silently observing him, adding notes about his behavior to my log after he left. My attempts to communicate rationally were completely stonewalled. I sent a polite, carefully worded email asking for specific details about the noise complaints, dates, times, the nature of the sound, hoping to address whatever the issue might be, even though I knew it was likely fabricated. No reply. I left a calm voicemail suggesting we meet briefly to discuss the situation and clear the air. My call went unreturned. The only communication flowing from his end were these terse inspection notices and increasingly severe-sounding letters reiterating the vague disturbances and warning of imminent further action if they didn't cease immediately. The silence from him, coupled with the constant threat, was incredibly isolating. I felt trapped, bullied in the very place I was supposed to feel safest. My evenings were now spent hunched over my laptop, frantically researching tenant rights in my city. I devoured articles about landlord harassment, wrongful eviction, the burden of proof for noise complaints. The more I read, the more convinced I became that his actions were not only unethical, but potentially illegal. His complaints were vague, undocumented by any credible source, like police reports, which would be standard for genuine disturbances, and seemed suspiciously timed around his desire to raise the rent beyond legal limits. But the fear remained. Could he still win? Could the sheer volume of his fabricated complaints sway a housing court judge? The stress was immense, a constant weight on my chest. Then, one Tuesday evening after a particularly grueling day at work, I came home to find it.
Not slipped under the door this time. Taped.
Taped securely, brazenly, to the center of my apartment door with thick packing tape, impossible to miss. An official-looking document. My heart leaped into my throat, icy dread washing over me even before I read the words. Eviction notice. It cited failure to cure lease violations related to multiple documented instances of excessive noise, disrupting the quiet enjoyment of other tenants. 30 days. Pack up your life and get out. I sank against the doorframe, the paper crinkling in my suddenly numb fingers. Tears welled, hot and immediate, tears of frustration, helplessness, and overwhelming injustice. All my efforts to be the perfect, quiet tenant, all my careful documentation, it hadn't mattered. He was actually doing it. He was throwing me out based on lies.
But then something shifted.
Beneath the despair, a different heat began to rise. Not the flush of shame this time, but the white-hot burn of pure, unadulterated rage. This wasn't about noise. This was about greed. Plain and simple. Getting me out wasn't just about getting new money, it was probably about hiding the fact that he was already taking illegal money from me. He thought I was weak. He thought I'd crumble. He thought I'd just disappear. The memory of his smug smirk flashed in my mind, fueling the fire.
Fine.
He wanted me out? I'd get out. But I wouldn't be disappearing quietly. He'd pushed me too far. He'd underestimated me. And as I stood there, clutching that hateful eviction notice, a cold, sharp determination settled over me. He wanted to play by the rules? Okay, let's play by all the rules. Especially the ones he thought didn't apply to him. My mind started racing, plotting. If he was this crooked about rent increases and noise complaints, what other skeletons might be rattling in his landlord closet? The following weeks were a miserable paradox. The profound sadness of dismantling my home, box by painful box, layered over a new, simmering sense of purpose. Packing felt different now. Less like defeat, more like intelligence gathering. Each item I wrapped, the teal-painted picture frame, the chipped mug from my favorite coffee shop, the books I'd read while supposedly making excessive noise, felt like a reminder of what he was trying to take, fueling my resolve. The apartment, stripped bare, echoed with emptiness, amplifying the injustice. Mr. Henderson, predictably, made himself scarce. No more hallway ambushes, no more terse texts. Having delivered the eviction notice, his job was done, or so he thought. He was just waiting for me to vanish. One dreary, rain-lashed Saturday afternoon, I found myself surrounded by towers of cardboard boxes, tackling the dreaded mountain of old paperwork. Bank statements from years ago, expired coupons, manuals for appliances I didn't even own anymore. It was tedious, depressing work. I picked up a thick, battered manila envelope simply labeled apartment stuff. Inside was a disorganized mess, copies of my original lease, utility setup confirmations, paint swatches. I kept everything. It's a habit ingrained by my accountant mother. Never throw out paperwork, Sarah. You never know. My fingers brushed against the renewal document from 6 months prior, the one detailing that second, outrageous rent increase. I pulled it out, along with the original lease, comparing the numbers again, feeding my own indignation. Original rent, reasonable. First increase, steep. Second increase, borderline predatory. The numbers glared back at me from the page. Then, something else slid out from between the pages of the original lease, where it must have been tucked away and forgotten. A thin, slightly crumpled piece of paper, folded in thirds. It wasn't mine. It looked like a utility bill, an electricity bill, addressed simply to tenant at apartment 2B, Mrs. Petrov's unit downstairs. It must have been stuffed into my mailbox by mistake months ago, and in my haste, I'd shoved it into the apartment stuff envelope without a second thought. Curiosity overriding my packing fatigue, I unfolded it carefully. It was dated about 8 or 9 months back. Stapled to the top, almost falling off its rusty paperclip, was a small, square piece of lined paper with a handwritten note. The handwriting was shaky, looping, clearly belonging to an older person. Mrs. Petrov. It read, "Paid Henderson $1XXX cash for rent June. Increase again. Says market rate way up. Too much for pension. Maybe time to look for senior housing." The dollar amount listed made me sit bolt upright. Even considering some increase over time, it seemed incredibly high for a tenant who, as she'd once mentioned, had lived in the building for over 15 years. Surely, long-term tenants in a building this old had some protection? Rent control. The phrase exploded in my mind. I remembered hearing whispers about it, about specific laws governing older buildings in the city, but I'd naively assumed my lease, being relatively new, wasn't subject to those stringent rules. But what if the building itself was? What if Mrs. Petrov and potentially others were covered? And if they were, then those hefty rent increases Mr. Henderson had slapped on me, were they even legal? My fingers flew across my laptop keyboard, rain drumming against the window pane like a frantic heartbeat. City Rent Stabilization Ordinance. I typed, followed by my address.
Click.
My building's construction date popped up. Built in 1938. Squarely under the jurisdiction of the city's rent control laws. My breath hitched. I navigated to the section on allowable annual rent increases. Strict percentage caps, tied to inflation, updated each year. My heart was pounding now, a frantic drum against my ribs. I grabbed my lease documents, a calculator, the pen from the packing tape dispenser. Original rent, allowable percentage for that year, calculation. Result, my first rent increase had exceeded the legal limit by nearly double. The second increase? Even more illegal. A wave of dizziness washed over me, followed immediately by a surge of electrifying clarity. It all snapped into focus with brutal precision. The manufactured noise complaints weren't just about getting me out to hike the rent for the next tenant. They were a smokescreen, a pretext to evict me before I realized my current rent was illegally inflated. He was likely systematically overcharging long-term, potentially less informed tenants like Mrs. Petrov, relying on their ignorance or fear. And newer tenants like me? He'd push the boundaries, hoping we would know the rules, and invent reasons to evict us if we got too close to the truth, or if he simply wanted faster turnover to reset the rent baseline even higher between tenancies. His greed wasn't just his motivation, it was the key to his undoing. The despair that had clung to me like damp clothes vanished, replaced by a cold, razor-sharp focus. I wasn't just being evicted. I was being systematically defrauded. And I wasn't the only one. Packing suddenly felt empowering. Each box sealed wasn't an admission of defeat. It was clearing the deck for battle. The eviction notice wasn't the end of my story. It was the trigger for his. A slow, predatory smile spread across my face, the first genuine smile in weeks. Mr. Henderson thought he was so clever with his rules and his notices. He had no idea I was about to use the city's rulebook to bring his whole crooked operation crashing down. Oh, this was going to be deeply, deeply satisfying. The final days in the apartment were a whirlwind, but now driven by adrenaline and righteous fury, not despair. Coffee became my best friend as I juggled packing the last of my belongings with meticulously compiling my case against Henderson. I wasn't just throwing things in boxes. I was assembling an arsenal. My evidence folder grew thick. Copies of both lease agreements, the illegal rent increase notices, printouts of his harassing text messages, photos of the passive-aggressive notes taped to my door, my detailed logbook documenting every incident, every inspection, every unreturned call. And the star exhibit, a clear scan of the misdelivered utility bill with Mrs. Petrov's desperate, incriminating note attached. I double-checked everything against the City Rent Stabilization Ordinance website, highlighting the specific codes he had violated regarding maximum allowable increases and harassment. The case felt solid, airtight even. For a moment, I fantasized about a dramatic confrontation during the final walkthrough, slapping the evidence down on the kitchen counter, watching his face crumble.
But no.
That would be too easy for him. A private spat would allow him to deny, deflect, maybe even try to intimidate me further. This needed official channels. This needed consequences that stuck. He used official-looking notices to terrorize me. His downfall needed to be official, documented, and undeniable. With hands that trembled slightly, not from fear this time, but anticipation, I navigated to the City Housing Department's online portal. Tenant complaint form. I filled it out with painstaking detail. Section 1. Illegal rent increases. I cited the specific ordinance codes, attached the leases and notices, showed the calculations proving the illegality. Section 2. Harassment and retaliatory eviction. I described the escalating pattern of baseless noise complaints, the invasive inspections, the stonewalled communication attempts, framing the eviction as clear retaliation for my unspoken, potential discovery of his fraud, or simply his desire to circumvent rent control limitations. I attached the logbook, the texts, the photos. As a final flourish, I attached the scan of the note intended for Mrs. Petrov, carefully blurring her name, but clearly stating the apartment number and the context. Hitting the submit button felt immensely powerful, like launching a perfectly aimed torpedo into the hull of his smug little empire. Move-out day dawned gray and overcast, matching my mood from weeks prior, but not today. Today felt charged with potential. The movers arrived early, efficient and blessedly incurious. I directed them, making sure the apartment was left utterly spotless. Cleaner than when I moved in. Mopped floors, sparkling windows, not a speck of dust left behind. I refused to give him a single legitimate reason to withhold even a penny of my security deposit. He arrived precisely at noon for the final walkthrough, clipboard predictably in hand. That familiar, odious air of smug superiority was back in full force, amplified by the sight of my packed life waiting by the door. He moved through the empty rooms, the click-click-click of his pen echoing unnervingly in the silence. He peered into the oven, checked under the sinks, ran his hand along the walls. Finally, he turned to me in the center of the empty living room, the place I'd first envisioned my new life unfolding. "Well, everything appears to be satisfactory," he announced, his tone implying generosity. "Minus the expected wear and tear, of course. We'll calculate the security deposit refund accordingly." The unspoken message, "Don't expect it all back." I met his gaze squarely, keeping my expression utterly neutral, a mask of calm concealing the triumphant storm brewing inside. "Mr. Henderson," I began, my voice deliberately low and steady, cutting through the hollowness of the room. "Before I hand over these keys, there's something important you need to be aware of." He raised a condescending eyebrow, radiating impatience. Clearly, he just wanted me gone.
Oh.
And what might that be? "Yesterday afternoon," I continued, watching his face like a hawk, savoring the moment before impact, "I filed a comprehensive formal complaint with the City Rent Stabilization Board." I paused for effect. "The complaint details the multiple illegal rent increases you've imposed on this unit, substantially exceeding the allowable annual limits as mandated by city ordinance." The change was instantaneous and glorious. His smugness didn't just falter, it evaporated like mist on a hot day. The color drained visibly from his face, leaving it a pasty, unhealthy gray. His eyes widened, pupils dilating in shock. His mouth opened slightly, then closed, then opened again as he struggled for words. What are you talking about? He finally stammered, the smooth condescension replaced by a rough, panicked edge. I'm talking about the increase notice you issued last October, I stated calmly, ticking them off mentally, and the subsequent one from April of this year. Both significantly violated the legal percentage cap defined in Ordinance Section 4, Paragraph B. I submitted copies of my lease agreements, the notices themselves, and the relevant calculations as evidence to the board. I let the silence hang heavy for a beat. I also took the liberty of outlining the consistent pattern of unsubstantiated noise complaints and undue harassment I experienced, culminating in this eviction notice. It paints a rather compelling picture of retaliation, wouldn't you agree? He stared, momentarily frozen. Then, a flush of angry red surged up his neck, battling the pallor in his cheeks. Sputtering indignation replaced the shock. That's absurd. It's baseless. Those increases were perfectly legitimate. Operating costs have skyrocketed. Market conditions. He was grasping at straws, his voice rising in pitch. The rent board investigators may have a different interpretation, I replied coolly, maintaining unwavering eye contact. My calmness seemed to infuriate him further, especially since I also included supplementary evidence suggesting that my unit might not be the only one in this building subject to similar irregularities in rent calculation. I let the vague threat hang there, picturing the scanned note in his mind.
Panic.
Raw, undisguised panic flared in his eyes. He knew. Oh, he absolutely knew he was caught. He knew what he'd done, and he knew I had the proof. His face was now a mottled patchwork of red and white. You can't prove anything, he blustered, desperation making him clumsy.
This is slander. Lies.
You're just a disgruntled tenant, bitter about being evicted for cause. Perhaps I am disgruntled, I conceded, allowing the tiniest, coldest smile to touch my lips. But the board has the authority to subpoena all your tenant records for the entire building, Mr. Henderson. Rent rolls, leases, communication logs. I understand their investigators are remarkably thorough. I suppose time will tell what they uncover. I held out the keys, dangling them slightly. He snatched them from my grasp, his hand visibly trembling. He didn't say another word. No threats, no final retort. He just spun around, his posture suddenly slumped, defeated, and practically bolted from the apartment. The sound of his hurried footsteps retreating down the stairs was the sweetest music I'd heard in months. The confrontation wasn't a shouting match, but witnessing his carefully constructed world of arrogance and deceit shatter in real time, seeing the sheer terror replace the smugness, that was my victory lap. That was the catharsis. He finally understood what it felt like to be powerless. The weeks that followed were filled with the quiet satisfaction of settling into my new place, smaller, yes, but blessedly free of lurking landlords and phantom noise complaints. It was managed by a professional company with online portals and clear procedures. A breath of fresh air. Still, a part of me remained anxious, waiting for the official word from the city. Had I done enough? Would Henderson somehow wriggle out of it? Then, about 6 weeks after I'd moved, the thick envelope arrived. Official letterhead, City Housing Department, Rent Stabilization Board Division. My hands were surprisingly steady as I tore it open. I scanned the formal language, my eyes catching key phrases. Following a thorough investigation, complaint upheld substantiated violations of municipal rent ordinance, specific code numbers, illegal rent increases levied against tenant Sarah, my last name, in Unit 3C, similar violations identified in Units 1A, 2B, and 4A. My breath caught. Mrs. Petrov. And 2 others. He'd been systematically cheating nearly everyone he could. The letter detailed the consequences. Mr. Henderson was ordered to immediately roll back the rents in all affected units to their legally permissible levels. He was required to issue refunds for all illegally collected overcharges, going back months, possibly years for the long-term tenants. And then the kicker. Substantial fines levied by the city for each violation, penalties designed to hurt. The total figure mentioned was eye-watering, tens of thousands of dollars. My eviction was also formally noted in the findings as highly likely to be retaliatory, adding another black mark to his record, though I didn't need or want to move back. Vindication washed over me, clean and absolute. A few months later, I ran into the young guy who lived in 4A at a coffee shop in my old neighborhood. We exchanged awkward pleasantries, then he leaned in conspiratorially. "Did you hear about Henderson?" he asked, eyes wide. The board nailed him. We all got rent rollbacks and checks. And get this, he had to sell the building last month. Heard the fines basically wiped him out, and nobody wanted to rent from him anymore anyway. Karma. Delivered via certified mail. His attempt to squeeze illegal profits had cost him everything. Looking back, that whole experience was easily one of the most stressful periods of my life. The constant anxiety, the feeling of being unsafe in my own home, the exhausting process of moving under duress, it took a toll. But walking away from that final confrontation, knowing I hadn't just accepted his bullying, and then receiving that official validation from the city, it changed something in me. It taught me the critical importance of knowing my rights, the power of meticulous documentation, and the necessity of standing up for myself, even when it feels daunting. Mr. Henderson tried to use flimsy rules and intimidation to break me. He thought his position as landlord gave him all the power. But in the end, it was the real rules, the laws designed to prevent people like him from exploiting others, that delivered justice. And the peace I feel now, knowing I fought back and won, knowing he faced real consequences for his actions, that's a stability no rent-controlled apartment could ever give me. It's the peace of knowing I took back control. And that feels like the best kind of revenge.